Greetings, Earthlings. I am planetMitch from planet5D.com, where we bring you the best DSLR video news, information, and conversation on the planet. We're excited to have with us Aviv Vana from BigLeague Cine Summit. We're going to be talking also to Matthew Santo, and we're going to introduce both of those coming up in just a second. I want to give you a brief overview of how this webinar is going to work. We're going to do 2 seconds of introductions, but there is the ability to ask questions. So right below the video, there is a box where you can type in your name and your email. We're asking for your email just in case we don't get to your question or we have a follow-up with that. We'll be able to get back to you, but then you can put in your question. We've already got 4 or 5 questions lined up from people who got here early. I want to thank you for being here. It's really awesome. I know some of you are coming from Aviv's list, and some of you are coming from Twitter. I would love for you to do a join for Planet5D and get all of the Planet5D information sent to your inbox daily. We get 5 free ebooks that you can get if you go to planet5d.com/join, and I'll put that up in the box in just a second. So you can just click a button. But we got 5 free ebooks coming to you, and now I want to introduce Aviv Vana from BigLeague Cine Summit.
Hey, what's going on, everybody?
I'm excited.
Yeah, glad to be here today. And we have also Matthew with us, and he's one of our hot presenters for the Cine Summit. So I'm very happy to be along for the ride.
Tell us a little bit about Matthew, would you?
I think I'm going to leave that for Matthew. He can do it way better than I can. But yeah, Matthew, you can give us a bit about your background, how you got started, how long you've been doing this. How you got to the level that you are today. I'll let you take over for a little bit, and then we'll get into the details of what we're going to do today.
Sure. Hi, I'm Matthew Santo. I'm a cinematographer coming to you from New York today. I grew up in New York, and I was kind of interested in doing film as a kid. I mean, when I was growing up, like, my father had a Betamax camera, for anyone who might remember what that was, and I was really fascinated by that. So that's where I sort of got into the beginning of sort of filmmaking. In high school, did a lot of theater lighting and realized that I could kind of combine the two. And New York, especially in the 90s, was a really busy time for a lot of TV shows, and a lot of features were coming back to the city for the first time in a while since sort of the early 80s. And I got the opportunity to work first as a PA and as a location assistant on like a lot of TV shows and features that were in New York. And the first movie was this movie called Ransom, which was this Mel Gibson movie back in 1996 where somebody steals his son. And I just got a chance to be a locations assistant on that, and kind of kept rolling whenever I had free time from school or whenever I was on vacation. Like, I was a PA or I was a location assistant, and got really lucky and started working with this small company that did all these establishing shots for New York TV shows and movies, like all those tilt-ups to the window for Friends and Mad About You that you might have seen on TV. Like, that's what we did. It was 3 or 4 of us. We went out and did cab to window 5 times a night. And so I learned to be a camera assistant through that, and decided I was much happier sort of in the camera department versus doing locations or production, and continued to work as a PM, as a location manager throughout high school and into college. But once I knew I was going to college, I said, I'm going to go to NYU. I'm going to be interested in cinematography. I really like the idea of sticking to the camera department. And then when I went to NYU, I knew pretty early on, because I was already working as an AC, that I really wanted to be a DP, and that's where I wanted to focus. And so when all these other kids in my class were trying to write their script and write their big senior thesis project to, I don't know, roll it into a feature or whatever, show your parents, whatever you do is your senior thesis, I only wanted to shoot them. And so I shot 8 or 9 thesis films every year, and kind of knew that that's what I wanted to do. And it helped me build relationships with people who were going to be directors while not being distracted about trying to become a director myself. And then after that, really, we kind of, I worked with a bunch of guys who were very focused on doing spec commercials and music videos, and short form work, and it helped to be able to build a commercial reel pretty early on, which was a big deal because I went to school with a lot of people who are becoming very successful in terms of directing and writing now, but it takes a while to get your first couple features going, whereas these guys left NYU with really solid commercial reels, and as a result, so did I, and it really helped to build an agent and kind of move from there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, there was a lot of things that I got out of that. First of all, what I heard was that the first step was basically just getting on set. You got on set a lot. That's what I heard in the beginning, which is so crucial. I can't overemphasize that enough. I think people don't realize how important that is. That when you're starting off, yes, you have to get out there, but you can skyrocket your learning by getting on set as much as possible, and that's actually what we're doing here in the Cine Summit, and by bringing people like yourself on. I can't get on a set today or tomorrow anytime soon with you. Well, first of all, I'm on the other side of the world, but besides that, there's other things that limit that. So by bringing people like yourself on, that's what we're doing with the Cine Summit, is to get people like kind of access to you as if they're on set, kind of pseudo. On set. But that's what I think a big takeaway that I want everybody to kind of hear right off the bat is that if you want to, really propel your level of filmmaking, get on set as much as possible, even if you're working for free. So I hope everybody caught on to that. So today we want, let's tell everybody a little bit about the presentation without, completely redoing it here. Obviously, everybody's going to be waiting for that. But basically, in your presentation, we focus on commercial cinematography and specifically beauty shoots versus action shoots and the difference in the lighting and all that. So what I'd like for us to talk about today, since that's so focused on a lot of that is basically the lighting differences, we phrase this today as, what is the number one thing that's hanging people up in their lighting, which obviously is one of the top focuses when it comes to cinematography, is getting your lighting and really becoming a master of lighting. So you gave me an interesting answer when we were discussing that on what the number one thing that gets in that you think people that would stop people from really achieving the lighting they want. So why don't we just dive into that a little bit, and then we'll start opening up for questions after that, and really kind of develop that a little bit on what that number one issue you think is, and let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I think when I was thinking about this last night, what I think my first issue in terms of developing sort of a lighting style, and what I felt like was hampering my lighting when I was first learning how to light and first learning doing student films and my first couple projects, is that I would tend to overlight. And I think some of that is a result of the time that I was learning to light, and you were still shooting predominantly film, and you were shooting generally slower film stocks, and you kind of had this need to put a lot of small lights out there. But I still think when I look at people who have been lighting for only a little bit of time, the thing that I notice right off the bat is that they tend to use way too many sources. They tend to try to learn everything or use everything that they learned in terms of lighting in one setup. And so I find that, where I would love to get away with, both in terms of just how quickly you can do a setup, as few sources as possible, and also because it tends to look a little bit more realistic. I've certainly seen when I was teaching and on some other sets where there are relatively inexperienced gaffers or DPs, that there are far more units and far more complicated setups than there need to be, which, if nothing else, wastes a lot of time, and you introduce the possibility of a lot of shadows and a lot of other kind of errant lighting sources that you don't really need, and it, aside from wasting your time, it also just doesn't feel very realistic. But to a certain degree, that's increasingly still the two issues that I think you run into even now in terms of lighting, is not having enough time to really explore the space that you have, given the equipment you have on hand. And I think that most director of photography is, really would like more time in terms of being able to do the lighting. Certainly, I think everybody, the biggest issue in terms of any sort of filmmaking, forgetting money for a second, is really just having the time to execute what they want, or at least having the time on set to figure out what it is they're trying to execute. And in terms of solutions to that, it's a little cliche, but I think preparation is probably the number one way to combat that. You know, having as much in terms of lighting plots and photo references and conversations with the director before you actually get on set is going to be probably the most important thing you could do. And whenever I start working with a director pretty early on, be it a feature or something that's as short as a one-day commercial, something very short, they sort of ask, well, how do you like to prepare? And I would rather go through as much information about the location, about what they're trying to achieve, about the look, about the aesthetics that they have in mind. I would take anything that they want to give me in terms of photographic references, art references, anything else, because that helps in terms of being able to show up on set and know exactly what you're looking to do. And I think building a lighting plot, even if it's just hand-drawn on a napkin ahead of time, even if it doesn't really reflect the location that you're going to because you haven't seen it yet, all can help you to have something to start with and maximize your amount of time. And I think just knowing specifics in terms about the tone and the look that you're going for helps tremendously, because the hardest thing to do in terms of commercial lighting is showing up on set and trying to make something look cool in a very non-specific way. When clients are looking for a product or for a person to just look good, that I think is the most difficult to overcome, because it's very non-specific and you don't really have a good place to start. One of the things we get into when we're talking in the seminar that I think is worth reiterating here is that especially when you're dealing with talent, when you're dealing with people that you're lighting, the more that you can know about them ahead of time, and specifically I mean the way that they look, the easier your time's going to be when you're on set. Especially if you have high-profile talent or anyone else that shows up that you don't have a lot of time to spend with them, and certainly not a lot of time to kind of experiment with how they're going to look on camera. It helps to see them ahead of time. I mean, most models, actors, you can kind of look up ahead of time, but at very least getting to know somebody who, when they first walk in the door, when they're sitting in hair and makeup, when you see talking with hair and makeup about how they're going to style their hair, how you're going to dress them, and being able to see them before they walk out on the set allows you to kind of really utilize that time properly, so you're not wasting their time once they step out in front of the light, so that you're just tweaking, you're not really lighting around them. And to a certain degree, I think the two biggest things that the industry that does this the best is television. When you think about, and I haven't done that much TV, but the times that I do TV, I'm always really impressed at the mechanics of how it works. It's not always the most artistic thing, but the machine that is regular television production is incredible, because they're very, very good at utilizing this time properly. And one of the most obvious things that they do that I'm sure everyone has heard before, but I can't stress enough in terms of utilizing your time, is block, then light, and then shoot. And I think very often, especially if you're doing a feature or doing something that happens day in and day out, you kind of begin to forget this, and you kind of end up lighting and then having your talent come in, and then you're suddenly ready to shoot. But it's never more efficient than really blocking with your actors, setting out the marks for them, then lighting, and then shooting. And it's worth re-emphasizing in that way. And TV is very good about that too, because they tend to have, they tend to use a lot of stand-ins, which stand-ins are a luxury item on a lot of jobs, but they're very, very important. Even if it's just a PA who is the same height or the same hair color as somebody that you're going to light, it very much helps that you're not just lighting air, but you're lighting a person, and you know where they're going to be, and you can have them walk through the blocking. And I find that saves tremendous amount of time, and then as a result, I'm much happier with what the lighting looks like when somebody actually walks out to be shot, versus if we kind of just showed up and tried to do it all at once.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, there was a couple things. I mean, wow, that was a lot. I need to really kind of jot it all down and go back point by point. But one of the main things that popped out to me, you said it right off the bat, was overlighting. You know, that's one of the problems, and that's what people do in the beginning is they overlight, because everything they learn, they want to put it to use. It kind of reminds me of, like, let's say, you know, you just got your slider and you love that sucker and you're like, wow, look at how cool this is, and now you try to get a slider shot and everything because you have a slider, so why not? Let's use it. So you have to use it in the right place. One of the presenters, you know, we have a lot of presenters, and one of them is whoops, drew a blank there for a minute. Frankie DeMarco. He shot a lot of feature films, and one of the things that he says there is exactly what you said. He says, "When in doubt, turn it out." That was the line that he used, which is basically turn off the lights. You don't know what the heck's going on. You're looking at the back of the monitor, and you're like, "Wait a minute, something ain't right." Well, just start from scratch. Turn everything off, and start turning one on at a time and seeing what's going on. You probably overlit. He says 99% of the times that's the problem, over lighting. And that's exactly what you just got done saying as well. So you know, I think as you get better, when you get to your stage, people start to realize that, you know, one or two well-placed lights can really hit home. It's just a matter of, you know, honing that in and starting to know where to do it. You know, what's like the first step when you start to light? What would you say the first thing that you do? You walk into a space. Let's say you already know the space a little bit because you did your research, you did your pre-production. Now you walk into that spot. You know, what's the first thing you're looking out for?
I mean, some of it I think depends on whether or not you're doing a commercial where, if you're doing commercial and say the subject is the most important thing, it's a beauty spot where there's a talent who's going to be in the center of the environment, then we might worry about him or her first and sort of say, like, well, how are we going to treat them in this environment that sort of makes sense for where the space is, but, you know, they're the critical element. We need to make sure that they look good, versus something that's much more realistic, a narrative piece that's for TV or feature, something else that the environment needs to feel like a real room, and you have to believe that we're there. And in that case, I think the first thing has always been for me looking at the sources. Where would the light be coming in? You know, if we're looking at an apartment, what time of day is it supposed to be? What time of year is it supposed to be? One of the big conversations that we tend to have a lot in, because we shoot in New York, we often fake for New York being a, you know, more suburban or nondescript environment. And one of the conversations we always sort of have is like, okay, this is supposed to be a night interior. Where is the, you know, if we see this window, where does the street light come from? Does it come from below, which suggests that we're on a upper floor and therefore in an urban environment, or does it come from above, which suggests we're on the first floor and that might be more suburban? What color is that? Is it, you know, sodium vapor, which again says we're in a city, or is it something a little bit, you know, whiter and more mercury and suggests we might be, you know, someplace more suburban? What other sources are going on in this room? Is it, you know, if it's a night interior, do we have a lot of lamps? Can we get away with a lot of table lamps and a lot of practical sources in here, or is there something else about it that shouldn't feel that way? Should we pretend that there are a lot of lights in the ceiling? Does that change sort of the environment, make it feel either more commercial or more high-end versus a lot of, you know, table and desk lamps? And once you kind of establish where the light is supposed to be coming from, and build something that's very realistic in that way, it can help determine sort of where you put your camera, where you put your actors, and everything else. And I think you develop a much more realistic sense of the lighting feels a lot more realistic if you're looking at what the space gives you first versus trying to light around the blocking or light around the camera to feel realistic for the environment versus the other way around.
You know, so to come back to one of the first points of the main obstacle being time, you know, once you've decided, you know, where you want your light to come from and how you have a visual in your head, you know, it's pretty simple. You know, okay, you want to light this side more than that side, so you put up that light, and then I think the biggest challenge, and this connects to what you're saying about time, is controlling that light. You know, you know what you want the light to be, you put it there, it lights your the main subject just fine. You have some practicals in the background's looking okay, but then you put on that light on your main subject, and it starts to, you know, it starts to run around, it starts to bounce everywhere. It's too much. It's not just focusing. So that you have to do all this gripping to get it, you know, to really hone in on what you want. And I think that's where it starts to get complicated, is how to cut the light and how to control the light. And that's where it starts to get another stand, and another stand, and another stand, and more time, and then it's bouncing off of here, and it's bouncing off of there, and that's where it gets complicated, and then that connects to the first point that you're making, which is time. You know, you have to really be efficient with all this so that you don't, because it could just take so much time to start controlling that light. So maybe you can speak on a little bit about the gripping aspect, which is, you know, for focusing and controlling the light, because I think that is where, you know, people start to stumble, you know, when the time gets away from them, because in the controlling aspect of it, it's easy to just put up a softbox and, you know, bam, there you go, I got a key on my talent, but it's, you know, maybe it's hitting too much of the table, and maybe it's bouncing off somewhere else and things like that. So, you know, the gripping, I think, is maybe where the time gets, you know, starts to run away on you. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a really good key grip is probably the most important person on set. I mean, like, a really great, you know, well, as a cinematographer, I am always more impressed when I have a key grip who seems to be able to shape the light really well than with anyone else. Or let me say that I find that the key grip does more in terms of being able to help polish the work of the cinematographer than almost anyone else on set. A really great gaffer is very important. A really great camera assistant, of course, is going to give you everything you're hoping for. I think part of it is I came up as a camera assistant. I did a fair amount of lighting, and I would like to believe I know a lot about lighting sources. But I'm always very impressed with the key grip who's able to elevate that. Because I think, to a certain degree, the way that we have certainly the system set up in the United States versus in Europe, where a lot of the grip work is covered by the lighting department, we tend to think of grip work and the shaping of the light is sort of a secondary or an afterthought, where I think it can make the difference between exposure and real lighting work. I think one of the easiest ways to deal with, and it's not always right for every situation, but one of the easiest ways to deal with helping to deal with grip work in terms of flagging off sources and controlling your sources, which is both fast and space efficient, is having a lot of sources that grip themselves. Certainly chimeras that have the grid in them are very useful. I think a lot of TV shows, you'll find that, and again, I use TV as a good example for this because TV moves so quickly. You know, you end up shooting 6 to 10 pages a day. That chimeras and reefa lights and other lights that have that kind of egg crate grid inside of them help, because you have a start with a soft source, but it already is cutting off a little bit of that spill. I think another very good source in terms of dealing with that are LECOs work really well, because LECOs are such a focused unit that already have the shutters in them. You can already cut off spill very quickly, and so you find that particularly in very tight practical locations, a LECO is really great to bounce into a ceiling. A LECO is really great as you're using it as a bounce source, because it does a lot of the grip work for you ahead of time. It doesn't mean it's going to clean up everything, but you don't have to wrap it in black wrap. You don't have to worry about it spilling out the side of a chimera. It's already cutting in because of the iris and because of the cutters on it. And so any source that you have that does a little bit of that initial grip work for you helps tremendously. I think it's usually a shame that they're very expensive, but the big light control grids, which are often referred to as LCD grids, which is confusing because they're not LCDs, they're fabric. But light control devices, which is a company, it's become kind of a brand name like Kleenex or whatever, but they make those, you know, 20 degree, 40 degree, 60 degree egg crate grids that go on 6 by 8 by 12 by frames, and it's a great way to be able to build a big soft source and still be able to control it a little bit in a very shallow way, and you know, you only have that grid sticking out a couple inches from your rag frame, and therefore you get away with being able to control a lot of the spill right off the bat. You still need to deal with a lot of grip work and everything else, but all these sources sort of help you initially so that you're not just putting up a sea of C-stands and 4x and 8x solids to begin to block in your environment before you've, you know, instead of doing it a little bit closer to the source.
We've got a lot of questions coming in, so if you don't mind, let's jump right over to some of those.
Sure.
We've got like 15 lined up already. So
Let's do it.
Nishant would like to know, how do I replicate a soft source coming from a small window and make it feel like that's so powerful that it's bouncing and lighting up the whole scene? Window might be also in frame at some point during filming.
Well, I mean, it is always very difficult to deal with having a small source that's also a very bright source. It's also a very soft source, and you do get into a bit of a conflict in terms of what's most important, because obviously the smaller the source, the more of a point source it is, the less soft it's going to be, and just physically, if the smaller the window frame or the smaller the source, the tougher it's going to be able to output a lot of light from it. I think if you're in a small room and you have sort of one small window and you're suggesting that that's where a lot of the light is coming from, what can help is if you're actually dealing with two different lighting sources coming in through the window. You suggest that there's a soft ambient light, which is actually what you see when you look at the window. It's what's actually bouncing in. It's what's filling up a lot of the room. But then maybe also that there's some hard sunlight or something else that feels a little bit more like a hard definitive light. And that you don't necessarily have to see. That can be at a much higher raking angle, but maybe that comes in and it bounces off the floor, or it's a much even if it's very shallow to the window, it's coming in and it's bouncing off of a different wall. And so you have a hard source that punches into the room a little bit, and it helps fill up the room without necessarily being the main source that's coming in through the window. And so you're dealing with basically two units: a very soft source that comes in through the window and fills in the environment, and anytime you see the window, it still feels fairly soft. And then maybe also a really hard unit that comes in, punches on the ground or punches off something else so that you can bounce a little bit off of the ground or off the ceiling. If you're in an environment, or if you're in a your script suggests that you can have that sort of hard sunlight. Otherwise, I would say that the big thing is continuance lights are very important. And by that I mean you light the window one way, and then you continue to light inside another. And maybe it's a much more significant unit that's punching in through the window from outside, and then right over the top of the window from, if it's on a set, it's a wall spreader of some sort. If not, hopefully you can put up a goalpost, you can put up a polecat or something else above the window and add a frame, and then you have a much softer source that's right above the window that you can actually light your talent or light the room with. And outside of that, I would say as much as you can utilize the window to kind of backlight or silhouette your action, the more that you can kind of embrace it and embrace that it's a single source. Anyway, without getting, I think that those are the broad strokes that I would come up with without knowing specifically what the tone and what the set look like. I hope that answers it. If not, we can follow up.
Right.
Well, Matthew, first of all, I just want everybody to Mitch, you're recording this, right? Because there's so much information in every sentence that I'm like overwhelmed here. But this is what it's all about. I mean, this is, these guys have given their time. Matthew's given his time today, and he's prepared an insane presentation, really specific for the Cine Summit. So make sure you get to that as well.
Absolutely.
But this is awesome. Let's keep hitting these questions.
Yeah, and with that, Mitch and Aviv, if there's ever a point that I'm saying something that seems like it could use more clarification, like if I don't define continuance light or soft source, let me know and I'll go back a little bit.
Just so everybody knows, those of you who are watching live, and yes, we are going to record this and we will post it on planet5d.com, but there is a link for those watching live below to click on to go to the Cine Summit registration page. If you're watching on this on tape, it's just go to BigLeague Cine Summit.com. That's BIGLEGAG. I can't spell. BigLeague Cine Summit.com. There is a follow-up question very quickly, which just came in about how do you spell LECO light source? LECO?
LECO, I think, is LEKO, but it's an abbreviation for ellipsidal lighting source, and LECOs are traditionally theatrical spotlights. They're long, thin spotlights that have a bunch of lenses in them, and they're called elliptical sources because they're relatively catadioptric. You got a bulb, you got a reflector, and then it bounces out and goes through a bunch of lenses. And what is useful about LECOs, because they've got all those lenses in row, they produce a very sharp source, and you can replace the lens barrel with a bunch of different lens sizes, like you could on a taking lens for a camera. So you have an 18 like an 18 degree or a 22 degree lens, or a 36 degree lens, or a 50 degree lens, which widens or tightens how much you're throwing the light, which means you also have a harder or softer source. And then they've got cutters and an iris inside, so you can actually cut down to create a very definitive shape. And that's why they're used theatrically, because you can build shapes, you can build projections out of them, and they work really well in terms of cinema lighting, because they're very easily controlled, and they're relatively small and relatively low powered, especially now that they're LED LECOs, for the amount that they can output in a small area.
Well, Matthew, they're very... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mitch.
I'm jumping ahead to the next question. If that's...
Oh, I wanted to ask them about that LECO, because I hear them often, and they seem like... First of all, number one, I believe they're pretty cheap, right, Matthew? Correct me if I'm wrong. But the next question I want to know about that, and we'll make this real quick, and we'll move to the next question, is they're a hard source, right? So when you use them, do not either bounce them or run them through something to turn them into a soft source, some sort of grid or of some sort?
Sure. I mean, traditionally a LECO is a spotlight.
Right.
Once you put lenses into it, you end up focusing it, and it gets harder and harder. I mean, you can soften them up. You can literally make them very, very sharp so that they have hard, defined lines. You can soften it so it's a little bit of a softer source, but what I think works really, unless you're doing something that's supposed to feel like a defined spotlight. I mean, we use LECOs a lot when we're actually trying to create that theatrical spotlight on somebody. But in what I was talking about before, in terms of lighting up a small environment where you're worried about gripping and so forth, is that
Gotcha.
Using them as a bounce source, they already kind of cut a lot of the spill out, because they're so defined and so sharp. I wouldn't. You can certainly put diffusion into them and then point them directly at somebody. Unless you're looking for that effect, it's a very hard source, and you wouldn't ordinarily do that. And so I think in terms of what we do, in terms of the cinema world, more often is use them as a very controlled bounce source. And yeah, they're pretty cheap. I mean, a tungsten incandescent LECO is, I don't know what the rental is, but it's, not much more than just like a 1K Fresnel. And they all have 750 watt bulbs or smaller, and again, tend to be much smaller if you have an LED in them, so they don't run that much power either. You can put 2 of them in any household outlet.
Cool.
A couple of more questions on those kinds of lights. Vanya says it's spelled LEKO, LIGHT.
Yep.
And Donald Schwartz would like to know, don't those LECO lights tend to be very warm in terms of color temperature?
Well, they are tungsten sources, so you tend to have, they'll put out 3,200 degrees. If, like any other light, if because they have a lot of glass in them, they can be ever so slightly warmer, because you tend to get a lot of dirt on the glass inside on the lenses. But we're talking about, 50 to 100 degrees Kelvin, not, nothing significant. The alternative, again, there are LED versions that can be any color you put into the back, and then there are HMI LECOs that are options as well. One of the cheapest and sort of most common versions is that there is the company that makes Jokers, K5600, and Jokers are a popular small HMI light, developed something called a Joe LECO. And a Joe LECO, which stands for basically like a Joker LECO, it takes a small Joker HMI, usually I think it's a 400 or an 800 watt HMI, and it goes right into the back of the LECO, where the tungsten head would normally go. And then now you've got an HMI or daylight colored LECO, and signiantly brighter.
This is a very popular question, actually. About the LECO, it's the LECO page says that it's primarily a stage light, not a film light. Is that right, and does it really matter?
Yeah, no, it's a theatrical spotlight, and that's where it came from. And again, that's why you probably wouldn't, in our world, point it directly at somebody unless you were going for that spotlight kind of effect. Again, like LECOs are really good because you can if you wanted that, you can build, because they can take an iris, and an iris, like a literal iris, goes into it, and you can put that into the iris, and you can build as big or as small a circle as you want on somebody, and you can do a follow spot and all those other theatrical things. Does it matter in the end? Not really. I mean, most of the movie lighting that we have is developed from theatrical lighting. Licos, floodlights, Fresnels, all were theatrical lighting, for stage lighting, before they, before we had a purpose for them in film. But they're very, as Aviv was saying, they're very hard lights. They're very focused. They're very sharp. So in a world where we increasingly use a lot of soft light and are looking for very, very flattering lighting, you don't tend to point a Lico at somebody unless you're looking for that theatrical effect.
Right. Gene Fido would like to know, is a Lico easily compared to a big dado, and also, do you use little dado lights on set?
Especially in commercials, we use dados a lot. And yeah, I mean, it's very similar. A dado, which is DEDO, is another small spotlight. And dados, the way that they focus in terms of the lens apparatus, especially dados, you can put these little lens top hats on them, which produce even tighter, very focused spotlight beams on the end of them. Work very similar to Licos. Licos tend to be, I mean, you can get Licos in a variety of sizes, but the standard theatrical Lico tends to be, significantly bigger. In the end, there are a lot of places that it's interchangeable whether or not you would end up using a Lico with a very, very tight barrel, meaning like an 18 or a tighter barrel, versus a dado. Some of it depends on how bright you need it to be. But there are places where we've wanted, especially in commercials or tabletop or anything else where you're lighting a small environment, where you need a very focused light, and a Lico would work or a dado would work. It kind of depends on how much output you need and how much control you need out of it. Dados are better for a lot of tabletop stuff because they're a lot smaller. They tend to have dimmers built into them and so forth. But they're essentially a bulb with a reflector and some lenses in front of them, so they're achieving a very similar effect.
Lots of awesome questions coming in. It's almost hard to pick which one we are going to talk about next. I'm going to jump ahead, if that's okay, a little bit to two questions about the Sony A7S.
Ooh, yeah.
Adrian and Eugene, both a similar question. How do you take advantage when using low-light cameras such as Sony Alpha A7S, the A7S? And, does that really impact how you light?
A little bit. I mean, as far as the A7S specifically, or any of the newer cameras, I mean, that tend to have, a base ISO of, the F5 is a base ISO of 2000. I think it was the A7S, and I could be wrong because I haven't experimented with it that much. Has an option to do, a 5000 ISO. Does it affect how you light? Absolutely. I think one of the issues we tend to get into with producers, and this sort of began at very much when the 5D became very popular, was this sort of sense of like, oh, well, they don't really need much lighting anymore. I think to a degree, I think some of the lighting sources have gotten smaller. There was a time when big night exteriors would have been rows of 18Ks and Musco trucks and all these huge lighting sources. I don't think you necessarily, or at least in my experience, have been using fewer big 18K HMIs than we used to. The number of lights has not changed. The number of people to set up those lights haven't really changed. How you treat them hasn't really changed, but just the amount of output from each of those lights has changed. One of the things that was sort of interesting when we were shooting, we shot a lot of girls, for example, at night, and when we were doing that, at least the episodes I was shooting were mostly at night, and a lot of what we ended up doing in terms of working outside during the summer in New York City is we had to shut off a lot of street lights. I mean, one of the biggest things was not necessarily where we were going to put our own lights, but how much of, if we were going to light this street with some of our own, 10Ks and 18K HMIs. We then had to shut off streetlights for 2 blocks with the city's help because that would interfere more than it would have a couple of years ago when the cameras were much less sensitive. It also affected how late we could shoot. That show shoots mostly over the summer, and to do a night exterior, you only have until 4 a.m. because you start to get a lot of blue in the sky already, and the camera will see it in a way that a couple of years ago it wouldn't have read that. And it definitely affects sort of your shooting time. And more than anything else, your ambient sources is the biggest thing that I've noticed. Is like, especially being in New York City or LA, which are big metropolitan environments, urban environments, you have streetlight sources and store window sources and all these other things that ordinarily you just sort of say like, it's fine, whatever. And now it's like, yeah, that does affect what we see, and it is creating another source. And so to a certain degree, that's great. You've got a lot of sources, but if you're trying to create something that is a uniform color temperature that doesn't have spill that you can control, you're suddenly being aware of all these location issues that you weren't before as a DP.
This is really, really awesome stuff. I'm really very excited about this. And of course, as a little plug, Aviv's Cine Summit that's coming up is also incredible. There are 9 presenters, and there are all these great presentations, including Matthew, and it's all free. So make sure you sign up for that. The link is below, or go to BigLeagueCineSummit.com.
Mitch, a few people have asked me, and I think I might as well just throw it out there just real quick, that they asked about the free and how long they can access it and all that kind of stuff. So just like we're recording this, and this is going to be available for anybody afterwards, the Cine Summit will be recorded, and anybody wants to have access afterwards, they can do that. They can purchase the lifetime access. So, but as long as they get there on the 20th and the 21st, no cost. Everybody can be in it, and watch it as much as they want during that time. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's awesome stuff. I watched some of the stuff from the previous ones, and it's amazing material.
Well, what's nice about what we're doing here is we're kind of just going on the fly, and that's great. But the presentations and like Matthew's, he took the time, and we thank him for that to pre-create a very laser-targeted, showing you light schematics and how we, all that stuff. So, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited to check out Shane Hulbert's piece as well, because he's he's a great DP. We shared an agent for a while, but beyond that, like, he is somebody who has been very traditionally extremely forthcoming with information, and his website has a lot of resources on it. And in terms of one of the things that I was going to get into, if we eventually talk about, is in terms of book lights and how useful that is when you're dealing with very small environments and don't have a lot of light to create a very soft, or a lot of time to create a very soft light. And he has a lot of resources on book lights. He has a lot of resources on anamorphics. It's definitely worth checking out his information as well. And his seminar will be, I imagine, very, very helpful.
For sure.
What's he presenting on, Aviv? Do you know?
Yes, it's kind of like a moving target with him. He has a lot of options, and I'm kind of keeping it under the wraps right now because it could, change as time goes on. But needless to say, I've never seen anything that he has put out which hasn't been very hard-hitting content. So it's gonna be off the hook.
Yeah, Shane's stuff. If you ever get to see him present live, it's just like you get goosebumps because he's so fired up about stuff. I mean, it's just incredible.
Right.
Sean would like to know, what's the most effective way to light a 3-way conversation while having all actors nicely lit?
Woo.
That's a good question. I am guessing, Sean, not that you can answer me back, that you're talking about 3 people sitting in a conversation facing each other, so like around a table. And if that is sort of the scenario you're talking about, right off the bat, again, all of this should be taken with a grain of salt or an asterisk next to it, meaning results may vary depending upon the tone and environment and location that you're trying to light. But usually, when you're dealing with people sitting around a table, your first instinct is to light over them and to do a source that's directly over the table that kind of envelops all 3 of them. Depending upon how how dramatic you need that to be, it can be something that's very, very that puts a lot of light it's a strong downlight, which will give deep shadows and effect sort of into their eyes and hit their nose and so forth, but will also bounce off the table and bring a little bit of uplight, which is certainly a very dramatic look. Or you can make that a very, very soft source. And if you're talking about a large overhead unit that kind of envelops all three people and it's very heavily diffused, or a bounce source, that can be something that's fairly natural. Certainly if it was, to use a random example, a romantic comedy or something else where you can get away with kind of building a little bit of artifice into it, if you can put a practical source on the table, certainly any movie that had Jennifer Aniston in the 90s, if there were three people around, I'm sure there was a flickering lamp on the table or a candle that was producing a very soft but attractive glow that was, coming up a little bit, that gave everybody a nice eye light at the same time. Otherwise, it was probably a very, very soft source. Even maybe like a pancake chimera is a great option for that, and that's basically a chimera that's cut in half and has that's a little bit flatter, and it has these sort of wraps that roll around on the side to help contain it. So it's already a little bit pre-gripped, and that sits right, you put that on a menace arm or anything else right over the top of your table, and it's an easy way to create a very soft light. Otherwise, like a china ball over the top of the table works really nicely. Very often we've done something like that where we've had to shoot around the table, and you've got three or more people, and so you don't really have a place you can light from. And so we ended up doing, a big, very soft source over the top, then maybe a very, very focused light, like a dado, shooting straight down into the table, and you kind of prevent your actors from crossing over so that you don't see that the shadow, or you don't see the highlight of them crossing through it, and that bounces a little bit of uplight on them, so everyone's got at least an eye light and a little bit of filth coming from the tablecloth or from the table itself. And the other thing is, if you're going to end up shooting around a table like that, what we've done is put stuff on dimmers so that everyone gets a backlight, and as you're moving around from person to person, the backlight disappears. You have somebody operating all that information so that everyone has a nice backlight or a nice key as you're moving around and as you travel, and the danger of seeing that unit or getting into its own shadow, those start to dim out and something else comes back up. And a Variac dimmer or just a 650 dimmer is not particularly expensive. It doesn't really require any more time or effort to put it in. You just need to have somebody who's coordinating that move. But it's an easy way to kind of be able to do, the advantage is if you wanted to do that one shot and that killed off your coverage, then you could spend that time rigging your lighting and not have to worry about building in too much extra coverage for that scene. I hope that answered it. If it's three people in another configuration, I'll give you a different answer.
Well, I'll give you a follow-up question that's fairly similar to that, which may help. Caleb would like to know, when filming dialogue, do you use two different cameras to get different angles, or do you set up the lights differently, or do you end up repeating the whole scene multiple times?
I was really hoping somebody was going to ask about multiple cameras.
You win.
And yeah, and I get to answer, well, it depends. Again, high time pressure setups, like TV shows, shoot multiple cameras. I mean, there's a reason sitcoms are always 4 cameras, but the advantage is certainly that you can knock out coverage very easily that way. Most DPs would prefer, if you're going to shoot multiple cameras or shoot dialogue coverage, that you end up shooting the person in different frame sizes at the same time, so you can focus on one person and one person's performance at a time. And I think when you're dealing with directors who are relatively inexperienced with multiple cameras, that's also better. Because the biggest issue I've always run into is, lighting is a concern too, but wasting time where if you're shooting cross coverage, where 2 different people are talking and you're in 2 different angles, not having, aside from having to light them both, you also then have the director who's only focused on one person's performance at a time, and then you end up doing the same number of takes, or always going back and watching playback again of somebody else's take, and you're not saving any more time. But either way works. It is easier to, if you're concerned about beauty lighting or anything else where you want to have a lot of focus on your subject as the DP, it is easier to light one person at a time, and therefore if you're going to do multiple coverage, do multiple frame sizes at the same time. So you're doing a medium shot and then a close-up at the same time with two cameras, and then turn around and do that on somebody else. That is not necessarily the case in stuff where you have a lot of improvisation. When you get to a lot of movies and TV shows that have a lot of comedy in them and a lot of comedic actors, and you have a lot of improvised lines, there are a lot of directors who would much prefer to do cross coverage so you get both sides of that conversation, because it's not necessarily going to be in the script and they're not necessarily going to repeat it. At that point, then you end up having to light both people at the same time, and you shoot 2 or 3 cameras. And it's fine, but you need a little bit more space because you need to, you're trying to keep both of your cameras or all 3 of your cameras out of each other's coverage, but also you need enough room to be able to light and grip 2 people at the same time. So any number of the above. Again, if you have the choice, it's always easier to focus on one person at a time, both in terms of performance and in terms of lighting them. Going from a very wide shot to a tight, extreme close-up on somebody, you probably would want the option to clean that up a little bit so that you weren't lighting them the same way that, in an environment, and then suddenly not have the ability to go in and kind of give them the appropriate eye light or anything else. But given the option, I would rather light for one angle versus having to light for the entire room at the same time. But, very often that's what you have to do anyway.
Based on that quick statement about the multiple angles, just quickly, are you shooting much in 4K right now?
Yeah, I think it's not a default. I think there's still a lot of stuff that's shot, particularly on the Alexa and other cameras that don't have an in-camera 4K option yet. That we shoot 2K or shoot 1080, and that's fine. But yeah, I mean, a lot of 4K. There are a lot of directors and a lot of production companies that like shooting red because they want to shoot 6K. It is always the advantage, and one of the conversations we tend to have pretty early on, if red comes up, or the F55, F65, any of the cameras that can do 4K, is whether or not there is a time savings to be able to do multiple frame sizes at the same time, to be able to shoot a medium shot and then also be able to extract a close-up out of that. Right. Because your depth of field doesn't change, it can feel a little bit like a cheat. And I think no matter what the resolution you're shooting at, if you're underexposing the image, or you don't have a lot of light, or your camera signal's sort of noisy anyway, then it's not going to be a great push in, even if you're starting with a 6K signal. One of the reasons that we can get away with, I think, shooting, not that I'm advocating the Alexa over any other camera, but one of the reasons I like the Alexa for a lot of situations is that even if we shoot only a 2K, it is a fairly clean signal, and I think you can push in maybe not to, from a medium shot to an extreme close-up, you can push in a little bit, and it still doesn't produce a lot of noise, and you can get away with that, even though your resolution is technically not full HD. Resolution doesn't mean anything if there's a lot of noise to your image, and it looks like a digital image that's been pushed in.
Right. Great answer. Caleb would like to know, for you, what would be the most important thing for a young aspiring filmmaker to know?
People, successful people in the industry.
Wow.
Which is
that's such a great answer. We need to let that sit for a minute. People really need to marinate on that one-word answer that really just, it's a knockout. People, connections, connecting and oh God, that was great.
Yeah, I mean, harking back to what you said initially at the beginning of this, I think getting on set is very important for a variety of reasons, and I also liked my time at NYU, and I thought that film school was valuable. And there's a lot of conversations back and forth about whether or not film school is valuable, and it depends on what you're getting out of it. What I got out of it were a lot of directors who I worked with who then went off and tried very hard to be directors, and some in the theatrical world and some in the commercial and music video world. But I left with a reel, but I also left with all these people who were then going to be the people that would hire me. And that, I think, was probably more critical than anything else in terms of being able to continue to build a reel and continue to have a job after I graduated. And getting on set hopefully does that as well. There used to be a paradigm of growing in the camera department that you started in a rental house and you worked in a rental house and you met a lot of first ACs and a lot of second ACs, and then someday they brought you on set as a loader, and then you worked on set as a loader, and then you got to know the second really well and worked up your way up and became an operator and a DP. I think that's still true, but there are so many more avenues, but it's all still dependent on having somebody willing to bring you onto a job, and just being on set allows you to showcase that you know how to be on set. There are camera assistants that when I was much younger that I worked with who were very helpful in sort of instructing me on how to be an AC and how to be a DP, and some who I just didn't really like working with. And I think if you don't like working with somebody, they're not going to hire you again. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly the connections that I made early on were what was most useful and are still most useful as far as being able to continue to branch out and network that way. And it's, I think, one of the toughest aspects that doesn't really get discussed much in terms of this industry, especially being a DP or being in the camera department or in lighting, because we're not the people who went into this to spend a lot of time talking with other people. We're not the actors, we're not the director, we're not the ones who decided we wanted to be really vocal and had things that other people needed to hear. And so it's very hard to then force yourself to be outwardly engaging and make those network connections and make those friendships that I think are going to be critical in terms of being able to develop a professional relationship.
I know Aviv needs to depart here pretty quickly, and we have quite a few questions, and Matthew's graciously said he could stay a little bit longer, so we're going to try to get to all of those questions. But before Aviv needs to depart, Aviv, tell us a little bit more about what kinds of things are going to be talked about at the BigLeague Cine Summit.
Okay, yeah, good question. So, I mean, the site has a list of the presenters, and under each presenter has a title of their presentation. It's somewhat explanatory, obviously as much as possible in a title as can be, but it covers everything. I mean, it covers everything that you can imagine from cinematography, from camera movement. I mean, the basics, right? Camera movement, lighting, lenses, and we have 9 presenters, so everybody, like 4 or 5 of them are really focused on lighting, like Matthew's is. So you can imagine, I mean, how much we just spoke about here in answering 2 or 3 or 4 questions, however many we got to, and every question has, has more follow-ups that we could get into. So, each presentation, the beauty of it is that it laser focuses in on something that the presenter themselves put together, and it's very actionable. That's what I love about it. Whenever I finish a presentation, I'm ready to go try it, go test something out, because it's just something that you see that they've done, they do on a daily basis. I put a lot of it to action all the time, what I've learned from the last ones. So, I mean, that's basically what you can expect. It's not theoretical talk. It's stuff that these guys are doing and how they're doing it, and they show you how they're doing it. And Matthew is a perfect example of that. It's really a lot of behind-the-scenes images and showing you how he sets it up and why he sets things up the way he does. So that's what you can expect. Basically, presentation after presentation is going to be like that. And again, free when it's live. And I know a lot of people are like, they want it to last a lot longer, but that's what it is. And anybody who wants to watch them on a on-demand fashion, we have that option. It's $97 to order all the presentations, and you can basically, watch it whenever you want, download them whenever you want. It's all yours. So that's the deal, and I think you guys are going to get a kick out of it all.
I muted myself, and I really messed up because I've not used Google Hangouts for presenting a whole lot, and I've muted Matthew. because he was touching something and kept stealing the camera, and now it won't let me unmute him. So I'm really screwed.
Matthew, are you muted?
There, I think I
him.
could unmute myself.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Well, good.
Great.
Well, thank you for bailing me out on that one.
Mitch, thanks for putting this together. I know you guys are going to stay on for a few more calls while you guys can, and Matthew is gracious enough to give us more of his time. He's already given me a lot of his time to put the presentation together. You guys are going to love it. You see how much knowledge he has. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So just make sure to be there. Check out for the email so you don't miss it when it goes live, and see you guys at the summit.
Thanks, Aviv.
Good to see you, Aviv.
Awesome.
Signing off. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Mitch. Everybody enjoy. Take care.
And I really appreciate all of the people tuning in because we're getting some amazing questions, and I don't think we're going to possibly get to all of them, so I'm going to apologize for that right off the bat. And I apologize for muting you.
No problem. Maybe it's a good sign that I will keep my answers a little bit shorter.
Maybe we need to have a lightning round. As a follow-up to that earlier question, we were just talking about, film school and all that kind of stuff. Caleb asked an additional question, and you've talked about this several times, but he wants to know, how do you get these extra chances to be on set? And I think your answer is probably going to be, you've got to know the people to get you in there, right?
And that's a big part of it. I think that I got very lucky. I was in New York City, and I knew enough people who helped me get to know other people that I got onto set. It is much tougher if you are in, let's call it, a secondary market, where you don't have an access to, there's a film crew down the block that's taking up my parking right now here in Brooklyn, but if you're somewhere else in the world where you don't have that access as very often, it certainly is a bit more of a challenge. I think there are a lot of resources. I haven't looked at them in a while. I imagine Mandy.com is still out there as it was years ago. And in New York, there is the Mayor's Office of Film Theater and Broadcasting used to, and I think still does, put out a newsletter that has, or a PDF that has information about what's shooting in the city at any given time. And there are plenty of opportunities to sort of call the production companies and call location managers and sort of say, like, I would like to come on set as a PA, I'd like to be a location assistant. And I think some of it is bad work, or at least it's not fun, but usually for a very short period of time. And I think as long as you go into it with sort of a pretty good attitude, and I think that the hours have gotten better generally for productions. I don't think PAs are, oh God, I hope I'm right about this, and I apologize if I'm wrong. I don't think PAs are abused the way they were when I was a PA. But it gives you a chance to at least build a little bit of a resume. And I think even if you can't put in a lot of hours, putting in a couple, showing on a set a few times and having an attitude and an energy that people appreciate, you will get remembered and get called back again. I mean, certainly there are PAs who are very available on jobs, and production managers don't like to call them. But there are the only way that I ended up progressing was that, at least as far as going from sort of in locations and then going to the camera department, is that I got lucky to kind of meet people on set who, I said, I like what you're doing, I like your department, I think I'm really interested in being involved in camera and lighting. How can I be of help? And I know that this is a union job, and I know that I can't carry around C-stands and so forth, but like, I'm available, and I would like to learn about this. And I think that in itself was very useful.
Great answer. And there are so many additional things. You could probably talk about that for an hour, because I've seen people on set that are sitting there talking on or texting on their cell phones, and I'm like, they're not going to get called back. Attitude's a whole lot has to do with it, like you said.
Yeah, and I think certainly that people who show that they're there to be part of the set and not to be there for the talent tend to showcase themselves in the best light. Don't
run around asking for autographs. Brian would like to know, and I'd like like to hear this answer. When you have moving subjects, what are your best tips for keeping them lit?
It depends how quickly they're moving. The broadest answer, and again, it can vary so much in what you're trying to achieve. Forgive me if none of this is applicable to your situation, but the easiest way to light a moving subject often is with a moving light. When, for example, a nighttime scene where you're walking down the street and you have 2 people or 3 people in conversation, you're tracking with them down the sidewalk. A pretty par for the course method in terms of doing that is, we tend to put some big lights up in corners of the street or someplace that represent street lights, and then and it gives you base illumination, a base color to work off of, and then a very soft source that kind of moves with them. Somebody hand holds or mounted on a dolly, just out of frame, is an LED or a gem ball or a china ball or something else. It's soft. It doesn't produce enough of a shadow that you really recognize it, but it's just outside of the frame, and it gives you a little bit of light to light your subject. And then that way, even as they go through different street light sources, past different buildings, cars move past, and all these things are great sort of urban things to have there to kind of help give you some energy and motivated lighting, even if none of them are real. I mean, fake car headlight gags and fake street signs and things like that. But that key source, that soft source that isn't really producing anything other than a little bit of ambient light, is a great way to kind of keep them lit even as you're moving through all of that.
Terrific. I'm going to buzz through a couple of quickies here. If you have to shoot day for night, you were just talking about a night shoot, so I think this really kind of is the opposite, but if you have to shoot day for night, what type of lighting would you use? And that was from Adrian.
There's not a lot of day for night that I've seen that I haven't that I thought was terribly successful. I mean, usually when you're shooting day for night, you're not doing that much lighting, and that's kind of the purpose, is so that you can get away from having to do a lot of big exterior lighting. If the most successful uses of day for night, or most successful times that you can apply shooting day for night, are usually when you're not dealing with very hard shadows, when you have daylight ambience, very soft light, and maybe some contrast, but you don't have, anytime you have very, very harsh sunbeams or dramatic shadows from, let's say you're in the middle of a forest, which is where most people end up doing day for night, and you've got all this like dramatic shadows of the trees, it doesn't very, and highlights of the trees on the other side, it doesn't really look like night, it looks like blue daylight. And so the softer your source, the more you can get away with suggesting it's moonlight. In terms of what lighting you would do, then anything you can do that helps soften that ambient. If you do have a lot of very dramatic, harsh sunlight, anything you can do to fill that in a little bit will help you sell a better day for night. The only thing that I would caution is that we believe we know what night looks like because it has contrast to it. And so I wouldn't get confused with shadows eliminating their contrast, which is very useful in terms of doing day for night, is to have very soft ambience but still having a lot of contrast on your subject. So anything you can do to help build that contrast, ideally you're shooting a day for night scene where there's a lot of cloud cover, and so you don't have a lot of shadows in your environment, but then you can still light your people independently with a little bit of contrast, so there's still some dark side that falls off, and then you expose for that highlight, so it goes really dark on the shadow side. That's a good way to help sell it. So you're lighting only a very only your subjects to helpfully build a little bit of contrast so that it feels more like night.
Yeah, you are so full of information, it's just amazing. Donald would like to know, what dimmers can you use that don't buzz?
Who cares about the sound department, honestly? That's a good question. The Variacs can buzz. There are some of it depends. I mean, one of the almost every copper dimmer, like a Variac, that has resistance to it, and the way that Variacs work versus traditional dimmers is that they produce a lot more resistance. You have a big coil of copper in there, and it heats up a little bit, and that's going to produce a lot of vibration, a lot of buzzing. So I would avoid Variax if you can, if it's really sensitive in terms of audio. Part of the big thing is just going to end up being having to put your dimmers further away. I mean, if you are going to be in a situation where you know you're running a lot of dimmers and you can afford the line loss, then running an extra stinger, extra extension cord out of the room is going to help you out a little bit. Beyond that, some of the magic gadgets that are electronic dimmers that can also do flicker boxes and things like that, those, because they're electronic, they're not resistance dimmers, they tend to buzz a little bit less. But again, it's been a while since I've been directly responsible for plugging in a dimmer, so that would be my most recent educated answer for you.
There are a lot of questions still coming in, which amazes me. I'm really excited that these people are so thrilled about all these kind of great things. Do you, Jen Fodio would like to know, do you have a best trick to make a nice, awful interior look good?
It depends on, Evan, I wish I could give you something specific, but it depends on what you consider to be an awful interior. Let me make some assumptions based on what are common awful interiors, which are very often small, white-walled, interior apartments that don't have a lot of windows or small windows. Or one of the biggest issues you always have is when you end up in a scenario like that, if you're lighting your subject, you end up lighting the wall behind them, and so you produce a shadow, and you also lighten up the wall quite a bit. So again, any of the lighting sources that have sort of grids or grip solutions built into them will help you a little bit in terms of not lighting the wall behind somebody. I think one of the there's a lighting solution that I wish I remembered who came up with it. I think I read about it in like International Photographer or ICG magazine back in like 1998. But for doing soft interior lighting, let's say in a white-walled room, that you take a source like a Lico and bounce it into the ceiling, and then they used Duvetine and created sort of like a skirt around where that was bounced into the ceiling, and so you had this soft light bouncing off the ceiling coming down onto the into most of the room, but that skirt was taped up around maybe a foot in from each of the walls, and it kept it from spilling out onto the walls. So you weren't lighting the walls as much. The walls were still remained a little bit dark, a little bit more dramatic. In a pinch, if you don't have Duvetine, you don't have Commando Cloth or the other grip solutions, I think you can use black trash bags, which can make a little bit of noise, but they're very good for the same sort of thing about, especially if you're talking about contractor bags or stuff that isn't shiny, and you're basically just trying to keep the light, the ambient light, and the soft spill coming from overhead from bouncing off the walls too much, or lighting up the walls too much. And that was a quick way to kind of just build the ambient in there so that you could light the subject without having to light the rest of the environment, which you didn't want to showcase that much.
I'm just amazed. I'm listening and getting distracted in what you're saying without looking at all the questions. So, what's your process? Bob would like to know, what's your process when you walk into a setup? Let's say it's a nighttime interior for a commercial shoot. How much do you light with your eye versus your monitor?
A little bit of both. I mean, I think you have to light by eye initially. Just because you until you have something to look at, you kind of let me go back and say it this way. If it feels especially now considering how fast the cameras are, lenses open to 1.3 or faster, the ISOs are very, very fast. If it doesn't look very realistic to eye, it's not going to usually feel that much better on camera, with the exception that often it is actually brighter in real life than it is on. Right. or I'm brighter in camera now than it is on set, where it used to be the opposite. But if the environment, you're lighting through the window and it just doesn't feel very realistic, it's not going to feel more realistic once you set the camera in front of it. I think that if you end up having, if you're building a lookup table on your camera, if you're using Rec 709 on your monitor, anything else, because there's no base value for what each camera looks like anymore, you kind of you're building a look into everything, or you're looking at the raw, but either way there's some variety of what the camera's giving you. You kind of have to let off the monitor a little bit. If the question is sort of in terms of dealing with just exposures, I tend to bring out my meter every once in a while just to check, mostly to pose for photographs, but to check that sources are matching, and to give myself some reference numbers to be able to look at it and go like, okay, I know what we were lighting the scene at, so that if I come back or I want to do a turnaround or anything else, I have some reference for where it was supposed to be. But I don't really light by meter anymore. It's sort of, I think a waveform becomes much more useful, especially checking with all these cameras. You tend to have a raw option, then you have your lookup table, or even if it's just the built-in Rec 709, and being able to kind of go back and forth and go like, okay, I know what that waveform looks like, I know what that waveform looks like, and having, knowing what that gives you, I think is as useful now as a light meter used to be in terms of shooting on film. And certainly by the time we get to, getting ready to really shoot the scene, that's sort of what I'm paying attention to a little bit more. But, even if you're looking at the waveform, even if you like the way it looks on set, unless you're going to be able to do extensive color correction, when you look at the monitor, if it doesn't feel appropriate, the blessing and the curse of the age of cinematography we live in is that the monitor sort of is what it is now.
Do you pay much attention to color at this point, or do you let the colorist do all that later?
It depends on whether or not I know. Commercials, we used to be able to be very involved in terms of doing the color correction, much less so now. And so I try very hard to have a lot of onset and, hopefully somewhat post-influence in terms of color decisions. There is a lot of conversation about that in Local 600 and a lot of the DPs. I forget what maybe was in the Hollywood Reporter recently. A lot of the big Hollywood DPs were talking about this being an issue, that they are losing control of color and color decisions because there's an increasing emphasis on sort of the cinematographer as the image capture expert. And not the image expert. And so I think the more influence that you can exert on set in terms of not necessarily locking in the color, but giving them as much information as they can ahead of time to say, like, this is what I was intending it to look like, here's the lookup table I'm giving you, here are the notes on what I'm trying to do, here are some stills that I graded that I think look like what it should look like. The client or whoever is looking at it afterwards will be happier, and you'll have more control over the image. Because ultimately, even when you're working with the colorist, you as the DP have had much longer, hopefully, conversations with the director about what this is, what you're shooting, and what it should look like and why. And the colorist, 9 times out of 10, and certainly if you're doing a big feature, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but most of the time, the colorist is coming in very late, and they sort of ask, all right, now that we're sitting here, what do you want it to look like? And that isn't usually isn't giving much credit to the story or anything else that you're trying to do.
Okay, we're gonna cut you down to 30-second answers. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. What makes a cinematography showreel stand out from Sean?
Oh man, 30 seconds. Okay, when I was in film school, I remember one of my cinematography professors saying that you need a celebrity walking through the rain at night, which is an exaggeration, but like that does have 3 elements in it that are like, oh look, you can do that. But in terms of doing narrative stuff, I liked looking at reels that had scenes to them. I think montage pieces showcase that you can get away with a couple seconds of a good shot at a time. If you can showcase something that has some reverse shots and shows a bit of a scene, then you show that you're not only able to compose one good shot per project, but actually able to got the fundamentals down about reverses and everything else that come with building a movie.
How important is creating a showreel?
I mean, I think as a DP, all you have really is, you know, the idea of being able to showcase your work. So I think it depends what you're trying to do. Like, I don't have I mean, somewhere I have a real narrative show reel, but like I do a lot of commercials, and therefore I have a website that has a lot of my commercials on it, and that's what helps get other commercials. Narrative montage reels, I think, are less important, because if somebody really wants to hire you to watch to shoot their movie, they're going to watch the movies that you give them. They're going to take the time to do that. I don't know, you know, like a 4-minute montage is only useful in terms of somebody looking at more of your work.
Yeah, and I see a lot of websites, like when I went to yours and other places these days, where there isn't just a reel. It's here's what I did, that movie and this commercial and that commercial. So, all right, we've got like 15 more questions. We're not gonna have time to get through them all, but I'm gonna ask just a couple of them. And again, shorter the better.
Yep.
We talked about 4K earlier, but are you concerned about too much detail? Donald wants to know. I know the actors and actresses are.
Yeah, not really. I mean, not as far as like detail for an actor and actress. There have been times where we've shot sets, SETS to be clear, where I was like, oh, this doesn't look particularly well put together, and then I'm a little concerned about like how well the set or the location holds up, or the, you know, like if it feels good that way. I think resolution and definition are two very different things, and you can have a high resolution image that also has you know, a lot of soft lighting and a lot of diffusion that kind of you can get away from having too defined an image, and you can also defocus a lot in post. That's pretty easy. You know, no, not particularly. I think that what concerns me about the 4K, 6K, all that is like this push to make resolution the main issue with camera quality. I don't think resolution equals quality.
And I have to agree with you on that. Not that my opinion matters much. I'm trying to come up with one good final question. I'm going to pick this one. Do you subscribe, and this is because I've actually been paying attention more recently to, you know, the blue and orange color scheme that a lot of movies have. But Donald wants to know, do you subscribe to the blue convention for night shooting?
Not really. I mean, that's a short answer.
That's the shortest one of the day.
Yeah. If you are trying to create something that has a bit that it can live up to, like it can afford that cliche a little bit, then sure. But generally speaking, not really. I mean, I think that there are ways to build it in terms of contrast and everything else. I mean, maybe you could go a little cold, but I think like the more successful night exterior, like night moon ambient lighting I've seen, actually has a little bit of purple, a little bit of green to it. Like, I think colors that feel right and feel good for your movie are more important than blue as moonlight. And like a really saturated blue as moonlight looks like 1980s Cinemax usually.
It's so interesting when you the more you dive into film, and I wasn't a film person when I first started Planet5D, but I've certainly become one, and I've learned so much, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I apologize because there are indeed 15 questions sitting here, and we just don't have time. We've got to let you go and respect your time. We've also probably got a whole bunch of people that are still sitting at the office that aren't working because they're watching this. So you guys have to get back to work now. Again, the BigLeague Cine Summit.com is where you can find out about the Big League Cine Summit. And my website is planet5D.com. Do you want to mention where you are? What's your website?
Sure. My website is mjsdp.com. My name is Matthew, Matthew Santo, Matthew Santo. And so either one will work, MatthewJSanto.com or mjsdp.com.
Awesome. Matthew, thank you again so much. It's been a wonderful pleasure. We've got an hour and a half out of you, which is incredible. I really hope all those people appreciate it. Thanks for watching out there. Thanks for watching Planet 5D, and make sure you tune into the BigLeague Cine Summit.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's awesome. Awesome stuff.